It's the evening of December 20th, 1987. The red afterglow of sunset is slowly fading into the dark, cold emptiness of the night on the snow-covered surface of Annapurna. The wind howls through the jagged rocks, biting into the icy air as shadows stretch across the towering, dangerous slopes. At a bone-chilling height of 7,500 meters, Japanese mountaineer Yasuhira Saito is clinging to the ropes with his body frozen against the steep cliff face. Below him, the heart-stopping drop seems endless, waiting to swallow him whole. He's the last man from his 4-person team, which had just conquered the deadly south face of the most dangerous mountain on Earth a few hours ago. Sitting at a height of 8,091 meters, 32% of people don't return from climbing Annapurna, and its south face poses an even more fatal risk. Yasuhira knows this all too well. Just a few hundred meters above, he witnessed one of his climbing partners slip into the mountain's cold grasp. The rest of the group have already returned to their camp, leaving him alone, pushing forward with a single thought in his mind: would he make it back to his team? It's the onset of the deadly winter season, and he is not even carrying any oxygen cylinders. Every breath he takes feels like a battle against the mountain itself. But then, cutting through the quiet of the night, he hears it. A faint call from below. It's his teammates. They are waiting for him at their camp. He can hear them now, which means they are very close, perhaps even less than 100 meters. For a brief moment, the weight of the mountain, the pain of his loss, the biting cold, all of it melts away. He shouts back with his voice filled with a spark of hope, telling them he's on his way. Back at the camp, his team members hear him. Their hearts are heavy with a bittersweet mixture of emotions. They sit waiting, expecting him to appear at any moment. But in that crushing isolation of the mountain, none of them could possibly imagine the heartbreaking truth. Yasuhira Saito would never make it back to his team. This is his story. The ancient Hindu and Tibetan civilizations, living across the rugged terrains of today's Nepal and northern regions of India, used to worship the towering, out-of-sight, unreachable mountains as their gods. Mount Kailash, for example, was worshipped as the home of Lord Shiva, and the highest peak on the planet, Mount Everest, was seen as the goddess mother of Earth, or goddess of sky in different cultures and beliefs, with some of them still intact in the local nearby tribes. The goddess of food or harvest was the title given to what we know today as Annapurna. However, ironically, while people used to see the mountain as a sort of life giver, the stats today tell a completely different story. For every 3 people who try to summit Annapurna, 1 doesn't make it back alive, and it's not hard to see why. The mountain's steep, unpredictable routes and wild weather shifts make it insanely dangerous. Climbers often say that trying to summit Annapurna isn't just about reaching the top, it's about staying alive long enough to get there. And that's before you even consider all the usual risks that come with climbing any one of the 8,000ers. Out of all 14, Annapurna 1 was the first 8,000 meter peak to be conquered back in 1950. The climb, though grueling, was done using the north face, which interestingly enough was considered the relatively safer route, though it still proved to be anything but safe. The climbing partners, Maurice Herzog and Louis Lachenel, lost their fingers and toes to severe frostbite and barely made it back after facing multiple life-threatening situations. The whole expedition was a nail-biting, near-miraculous feat that somehow didn't end in disaster. Fast forward 2 decades to 1970, when the British climbers became the first to summit Annapurna using the south face, which is the mountain's most lethal side. That's because an infamous 3,000 meter steep ice wall climbs almost all the way to the summit, making the route even more dangerous, especially considering Annapurna's already fatal reputation. On May 27, 1970, British mountaineers Don Willens and Dougal Haston reached the summit. But since it was during the summer climbing season, the challenge of summiting Annapurna in winter was still waiting for someone to claim. 17 years later, In 1987, two Polish climbers, Jerzy Kukuczka and Arthur Hager, made the first winter ascent of Annapurna without supplemental oxygen. However, realizing just how dangerous their mission already was, they took the safer route up the northern side instead of the south face. But it wasn't long before other mountaineers started eyeing that record too. The Japanese climbers from the Gunma Mountaineering Association had already tried their hand at it 2 years earlier, in 1985. They got as far as 7,200 meters, but had to turn back due to heavy, unpredictable snowfalls typical of Himalayan winters. The GMA team, however, didn't give up. They left the mountain with a renewed determination to tackle the challenge again with more experience and better resources. Soon after, 8 members of the GMA joined an expedition to Everest to learn deeply about the harsh Himalayan conditions. The trip went just as expected, and armed with all the knowledge they gained, the core team recruited 14 members for a new expedition to Annapurna's south face, including all 8 members from the Everest team, who had collectively summited various 8,000-meter peaks for a total of 17 times. So in terms of experience, this was by far the most prepared expedition to Annapurna up until that point, but the risk was still something that couldn't be taken lightly. Apart from the climb itself, the biggest concern was the weather. The team hoped to set up their final camp before making their summit push in early December. However, by the end of the month, one of the season's worst snowfalls was expected. This meant that if the expedition ran late, not only might their summit attempt be delayed, but the entire mission could go horribly wrong. The obvious fix would have been to reschedule to a different time. However, moving it earlier would disqualify the climb as a true winter ascent, since the official Himalayan winter season runs from late December to February. Their planned time frame of early December was already pushing that limit. Delaying until January or later wasn't a solid option either, as conditions would only worsen, so the first 2 weeks of December were their only shot. This implied they have to travel from base camp to the summit in just 15 days, a task that would be almost impossible for a regular expedition. On paper, they thought they could make it work by streamlining their approach. They decided to cut the number of camps from the 7 used by the British expedition in 1970 down to just 5. This would mean less equipment and fewer supplies to haul, making things lighter for the climbers and porters, helping them move faster. They also planned to move the base camp closer to the mountain's south face, making everything efficient from logistics to the climb itself, ultimately cutting down on time spent in the more exposed areas of the mountain. But there was still a major loophole in this entire plan. When climbing a mountain, one of the most important survival factors is acclimatization. This usually means spending anywhere from a few hours to several days at various camps, depending on how high you are. The process of climbing and acclimatizing go hand in hand as climbers work their way up. In their condition, trying to rush to the summit in just 15 days wouldn't leave much time for this crucial step, which would put their safety on the line. And given how harsh Annapurna's terrain was, attempting it like that would basically be signing up for a suicide mission. After a lot of thinking and hitting a few dead ends, the team finally came up with a smart solution. Instead of trying to cram everything into one go, they decided to split the process. They figured they could focus on acclimatizing beforehand, and then attempt the summit later. Nearby, in the same Himalayan region, were 2 relatively safer zones, Tent Peak and Glacier Dome. Tent Peak at 5,663 meters is a popular trekking peak in the Annapurna region, while Glacier Dome, standing at 7,200 meters, has a rounded summit. Both were less technically challenging than Annapurna, and the glaciers and snowfields were very similar to what they'd face on the main peak. The team decided to use these locations as training grounds, acclimatizing there in the last few days of November, preparing their bodies for the high altitude grind. Once December rolled around, signaling the start of the Himalayan winter season, they'd launch their summit push, bypassing the typical on-the-go acclimatization process. This would allow them to complete the climb within their 2-week deadline, technically achieving a winter ascent, while finishing before the worst of the bad weather would arrive. By November 22, 1987, the climbers from the Gunma Mountaineering Association had set up a new base camp right at the foot of Annapurna's imposing south face wall at 4,300 meters. This was about 600 meters higher than the standard base camp used by previous expeditions, giving them a head start on the climb and shaving off some precious time. For the next week, The organizing team and support staff dove headfirst into planning and mapping out their route up the mountain. Meanwhile, all 11 climbers were busy with intense acclimatization drills. They tackled the 5,663 meters of Tent Peak for a total of 27 times. These repeated ascents allowed their bodies to adapt to the altitude and thin air, while also testing their physical limits. On Glacier Dome, they aimed to reach 7,000 meters, but only managed to get up to 6,000 meters in the limited time they had. Even so, it was enough to give them valuable insight into the mountain's conditions. The final days before the climb were spent resting and fine-tuning their preparations. On December 1st, with all high spirits and plenty of confidence, the team began their ascent of Annapurna's south face. Thanks to the week of thorough planning, they successfully reached the location for Camp 1 the same day, setting it up at 5,300 meters. That first night was spent settling in, and by the next morning, they were hard at work preparing the route to Camp 2. Since this path followed a previously established Trail 2, progress was even faster. By December 3rd, the support staff had carried all the essential climbing gear to the Camp 2 site, and it was set up at 6,100 meters. While the plan was to finish the climb within 15 days, the team had prepared for the worst by bringing extra food and supplies to survive at least 2.5 months in case of emergencies. Most of this additional gear was stored at base camp in Camp 1, while only the essentials were carried by porters to higher camps. So far, everything seemed to be falling into place, almost too smoothly, but it wouldn't be long before the mountain started to show its true, unforgiving nature. The same day they set up Camp 2, a massive hanging glacier from the upper south face collapsed, triggering a deadly avalanche that came barreling towards Camp 1. While the camp wasn't directly in its path, it still took a heavy hit. In an instant, nearly 90% of their equipment, food, and rescue gear was swept away. The support staff barely managed to escape with their lives, diving under a giant ledge to take cover. The impact was more brutal than anyone had expected, but the team pulled themselves together quickly and began to make do with the remaining resources from base camp. Yet the weather just kept getting worse. 3 days later, they managed to climb 750 meters and reached the location for Camp 3 at 6,850 meters, all while ice rocks were raining down on the entire south face. The next morning, one of the team members who had been helping with route selection was struck on the leg by one of these falling rocks and had to be evacuated to a lower camp to recover. It took 4 more days at the site of Camp 3 to clear the debris and find a safe spot to set up the camp on December 10th, but the very next day, another setback came. A heavy 1-meter snowfall accompanied by extreme winds covered the mountain, halting their progress for the next 72 hours. For a bit of context, a snowfall of 6 to 8 inches within 24 hours is considered dangerous enough to issue a warning in normal residential areas. Here, not only was the snow more than 500% of that, but it was happening on the deadliest mountain in the world, and it wasn't even near the kind of snowstorms they'd been trying to avoid later in December. The mountaineers spent 3 agonizing days and nights stuck in the snow, unable to move, wondering whether they'd ever reach the top of the mountain, or worse, even survive long enough to make it back down alive. On December 13th, when the situation finally started to ease up, the team realized that the heavy blizzard had actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise. The snow had packed down the unstable rocks on their entire route up the south face, effectively locking them in place. So the constant danger of falling rocks, which had been their biggest threat until then, was no longer a concern. With a renewed sense of hope, the mountaineers climbed into their tents, packed up, and before long, they were making their way up the route again. They quickly surpassed the 7,200 meter mark, which had been the highest point they'd reached during their failed attempt in 1985. Not long after, they arrived at the base of a massive 100-meter rock face known as the Flat Iron. This was the most critical part of their entire south face route before reaching the summit. But spirits were high, and despite the tough climb, one of the team members took on the Flat Iron. After 4 hours of intense effort, he successfully established a climbing line, allowing the rest of the team to follow. 4 more days of tough trekking later, the The 11 climbers, along with the support team, set up their fourth and final camp at 7,400 meters. By this point, they were already behind schedule due to the snowfall, but it wasn't that bad yet. If the conditions cooperated, they still had a shot at reaching the summit within the next 3 to 4 days and getting back to safety before the bad weather hit. While their instincts were right, the start on Camp 4 didn't go exactly as planned. The camp was set up on a snow ridge, and the fresh snow looked perfect for setting up tents. But when they started digging, they hit a hard layer of ice just beneath the surface. This meant they couldn't properly anchor the tents, and about a third of the tents in Camp 4 weren't secured well enough to withstand the rushing winds. At night, things got far more miserable, and some members of the team had to huddle together for warmth instead of crawling into their sleeping bags, hoping to share whatever body heat they could generate. In those brutal, near inhumane living conditions, the climbing team spent 2 more days fixing the ropes on their route before deciding to make their final push to the summit. They split into 2 groups, each with 6 to 7 members, including a couple of porters to assist both teams. The first team consisted of 4 climbers, 3 of whom were seasoned professionals. Leading the group was the most experienced climber, Nobuo Yamada, alongside his long-term climbing partner, Yasuhira Saito. This duo made headlines back in December 1985 when they summited Manaslu and brought back the peace can, left by the Japanese Alpine Club during their first ascent of Manaslu in 1956. This tobacco canister, often called a message can or peace can, held the names of the summit team members or messages of goodwill, which was a symbolic gesture that resonated deeply with Japanese climbers. The third member was another expert mountaineer, Teru Saingasa, and rounding out the group was the youngest climber, a 22-year-old named Toshiyuki Kobayashi. Kobayashi was a student at Gunma University and had already been part of 2 Everest expeditions by the time he was 19, making it all the way to the South Col. Though he didn't have tons of experience yet, his youth and energy were undeniable. He played a key role in helping set up the ropes on the mountain, earning the respect and trust of the more seasoned climbers in his group. This 4-member team, along with their support staff, set off from Camp 4 at 3:40 a.m. on December 20th, heading into the pitch-black night. The temperatures were still bone-chilling, but surprisingly, the weather was calm with no wind, which was a welcome break from the brutal conditions they faced earlier. After about 5.5 hours of trekking, they finally made it to the mini rock band. It was basically this small, rocky outcrop sticking out from the snow, like a big speed bump on a steep hill. At this point, they were climbing up a slanted snowfield, watching their steps carefully. But once they passed the mini rock band, the next part was way trickier, like a slippery, steep wall of ice, known as the snow face, which eventually led them to a giant ridge. Around noon, they reached a steep section made of sharp rocks and huge ice blocks called the rock face. It was like trying to scale the side of a tall, uneven building, except everything was slippery and covered in snow. This was the hardest part of their climb, requiring ropes, harnesses, and a whole lot of muscle strength. It took them about 2 more hours to get past that section, and by the time they reached the next part, the conditions were still manageable. They figured they could make it to the top in just a couple of hours. From the rock face to the summit, it was about an hour of walking along a narrow ridge with steep, terrifying drops on both sides. One wrong step, and you could be tumbling down for miles, straight into endless snow and jagged rocks. And with no direct sunlight hitting that section, the freezing cold made it all even more intense. Finally, around 3:15 p.m., 4 of them made it to the last stretch of the ridge and stepped onto the summit of Annapurna. They pulled out their cameras to film their achievement, taking in the incredible views that made everything worth it. With excitement running high, they radioed back to base camp, letting the rest of the team know about their success. Months of non-stop preparations, grueling acclimatization drills, long, sleepless nights, battling through exhaustion, and above all, freezing, bone-chilling conditions had all come down to this one life-defining moment. They've done it. They were the first ever climbers to make it to the top of Annapurna's south face in the heart of winter, and they did it without any supplemental oxygen. But of course, as amazing as that felt, they knew the job wasn't entirely done yet. They were already 5 days past their 2-week window, and the weather could turn on them in no time. The next, even bigger challenge was getting back down, a task that would take far more care and caution. While their acclimatization drills on Tent Peak and Glacier Dome had been super helpful so far, it had already been a long, exhausting journey, and now they could feel their energy slipping. They knew it was only a matter of time before things could start going sideways if they weren't careful. After spending about half an hour at the summit, the 4 climbers decided it was time to head down. Splitting into 2 groups, Saingasa and Kobayashi went first, followed by Yamada and Saito, who started their descent at exactly 3:48 p.m. The first hour went smoothly, with Saingasa and Kobayashi leading the way down at a good pace, quickly reaching the rock face again. But now, things were tricky. The descent here was much more challenging than the climb, which had taken them 2 hours earlier. Kobayashi, being in front, took the lead on the trail ropes, carefully making his way down. It took him some time, but he finally reached the bottom of the rock face and made it to a gentle slope. However, just as he thought he was past the worst of it, he stepped onto a large, overhanging mass of soft snow, unaware that there was no solid ground beneath it. Before he could even react, the massive snow chunk broke loose, and he plunged down the steep face, falling for what seemed like miles. His teammates above had no clue where he would eventually land. All they knew was that the fall would have been fatal. The remaining trio was shocked and devastated by the loss, but the clock was ticking, and they had no time to dwell on their grief. They pushed forward, continuing their descent. About half an hour later, at 5:30 p.m., they reached the point where the fixed ropes were set up and began rappelling down one by one. As they descended, visibility began to drop with the red afterglow of the setting sun falling on the snow. While they had been sticking close together at first, but as the descent went on, they gradually started to spread out. By around 7 p.m., Yamada and Saingasa had made it back to Camp 4, while Saito was still coming down a little behind, following the rope trails. The long exposure to the thin air had really worn him out, and he was struggling. Despite this, his teammates remained hopeful that he'd catch up soon. Even though they couldn't see much with the bad light and constant whiteouts, they had a gut feeling that he had to be close. That turned out to be spot on, when someone from the support staff at Camp 4 yelled out Sato's name, asking if he was okay. Just seconds later, his voice echoed back, telling him that he was on his way down. Hearing him was a massive relief for everyone. They finally had confirmation that he was fine, but after waiting a while, Saigasa decided to go meet him in person just to be sure. He stepped out of camp and climbed a short distance uphill, and sure enough, there was Saito making his descent down. He looked a bit tired, which was totally expected after that climb. Saigasa called out to him, asking how he was doing. Saito assured him he felt alright, but then as their brief exchange continued, Saigasa asked the same question again, perhaps out of lingering concern or just to double check. And this time, sounding a bit amused, Saito threw the question back at him, almost as if to ask why he was so concerned. He began to say, "What's the matter?" but didn't get the chance to finish his sentence. Out of nowhere, the ground beneath Saito gave way, revealing a dark, gaping void. In what felt like less than a blink of an eye, Saito slipped and fell into the opening, vanishing from sight instantly, just like Kobayashi before him. Saigasa stood rooted to the spot, utterly frozen in shock, watching as sparks flew from Sato's crampons, scraping against the rocks during his fall. Eventually, he returned to camp to break the devastating news. The joy of their success had turned into the depths of despair after losing 2 team members, one after the other. Overwhelmed by grief, the team decided to cancel any further summit attempts and officially abandoned the expedition. Search helicopters took to the skies immediately, scouring the mountain for any trace of the missing climbers. For 5 agonizing days, they battled the harsh elements of the mountain, combing the entire south face. But on December 27th, the weather started to worsen and hope ran out, so the operation was called off. To this day, the bodies of these 2 climbers are still somewhere out there on the unforgiving slope of the killer Annapurna. And as the legendary author Barry Finlay once said, every mountaintop is within reach if you just keep climbing. Yet sometimes, that reach comes with a price that's too high. The Japanese climbers carried that truth with them throughout the whole expedition. They managed to pull off something that seemed impossible, something smart and innovative, but in the end, it all came at a cost that no one should ever have to pay.